to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the first in a series of programs I'm doing on the very famous 16th century French writer, Michel de Montaigne. Why do programs about him? Well, because like the American Ralph Waldo Emerson, about whom I did a series of 10 programs, Montaigne is considered to be one of the great wisdom writers in the Western tradition. He writes about the difficulties and joys of everyday living and what we might all do to live more fulfilling lives. Like Emerson, Montaigne was a great essayist. His focus is on the various dimensions of the human condition. One can easily access his essays if one goes to any fine bookstore, such as Barnes and Noble, for example. You can be sure that they have books which are collections of Montaigne's essays. And of course, any library has books which are collections of Montaigne's essays. Among the specific themes Montaigne deals with in his essays are the following: lifelong education and what might be the most important things we can learn in life. He also deals with human nature. In fact, some Montaigne scholars claim that Montaigne's chief interest really was in human nature, discovering what it's really all about. Other topics he focuses on in his essays are the following: friendship, love, sex, religion, marriage, children, the value of reading good books, the art of conversation, and sickness and death. His essays are relatively short. Some of his essays only run 3 or 4 pages. I would guess his typical essay runs between 20 and 25 pages. He's relatively easy to read. Indeed, 14-year-olds in France are regularly assigned some of his essays to read. Montaigne's writing style is conversational. In reading his essays, one can imagine oneself sitting at a table opposite Montaigne and sipping some good French wine or drinking some fine French coffee. I mentioned that Montaigne was born in the 16th century. Specifically, he was born in 1533 in Bordeaux, France, and lived most of his life there, and died at age 59 in the year 1592. Literary critic Harold Bloom claims that Shakespeare and Montaigne were the greatest writers of the Renaissance. Shakespeare was 28 years old when Montaigne died, and therefore was just hitting his stride as a great writer. Shakespeare, incidentally, died at age 51. Montaigne is much easier to read than Shakespeare. And who are some of the other great wisdom writers, besides Emerson, Montaigne, Shakespeare? Well, among my personal favorites, the philosophers Plato and Seneca, the novelists Tolstoy, Cervantes, and Proust, and among others, Sigmund Freud, and again, I've already mentioned Emerson. And I've left out many of the great wisdom writers. Again, I've just listed a few of my favorites. Specifically, how can these wisdom writers help us? Well, they give us insights about the nature of reality. They give us insights about the way things really are. We all have illusions. We all have mistaken ideas about life and human nature, for example, and great writers can help free us from these illusions. And while they can help us to better enjoy life, they can also help us to better endure those rough spots in life which cannot be avoided. Great writers can provide an opening to a larger life. They wake us up. They help us to see and understand aspects of reality about which we were either ignorant or blind. Now on to Montaigne himself and some of the important ideas he expressed in his essays. One of his fundamental ideas, perhaps his most fundamental idea, concerns the art of living. And let me give you Montaigne's own words. There is nothing so difficult to learn as to how to live this life well and naturally. This reminds me of something a famous baseball player once said. Darryl Strawberry, former baseball star, played with both the Mets and the Yankees and had serious problems with alcohol and other drugs. In fact, went into rehabilitation several times. And I recall seeing Strawberry on the television program 60 Minutes talking about his problems, and he said this, and I'm quoting Darryl Strawberry, "I know everything about hitting a baseball and nothing about life." I think his remark is probably relevant to some other stars, baseball stars, and also entertainment stars, again, who have had problems with drugs and other personal problems. People such as Britney Spears, for example, who, like Strawberry, have checked themselves into rehabilitation centers. And what do the Strawberries and the Britney Spears of this world hope to learn in rehabilitation from professional therapists? Well, I think one of the things they're trying to learn are lessons about the art of living and how to live better. And I have no doubt that if one reads Montaigne, one will learn some lessons about how to live this life in a better way. And again, how to endure many of the rough spots. Montaigne asks his readers the following question: have you been able to reflect on your life and control it? Then you have performed the greatest work. According to Montaigne, what is our chief duty in life? Again, his own words. Our duty is to compose our character, not compose books or win battles, but rather to achieve order and tranquility in our lives. To achieve order and tranquility in our lives. That is our chief duty in life, according to Montaigne. He goes on to say, our great and glorious masterpiece is to live properly. Our great and glorious masterpiece is to live properly. Montaigne also said this, and I think this is illuminating. Again, his own words. Life must be studied, relished, and meditated upon. And meditated upon. It takes good management to enjoy life. Montaigne would have agreed with Thoreau that to affect the quality of the day is the highest of arts. In arguably his most famous essay, entitled On Experience, again, entitled On Experience, he says this: all that I am scribbling here is but a record of my life's experiences. In other words, in so many of his essays. He's really telling you what he's experienced in life and what he's learned from those experiences, and sharing his learning with the reader in the expectation that perhaps the reader can also profit from what Montaigne has learned from his 59 years in life. And according to Montaigne, what have his life experiences taught him? Well, among the chief lessons, he says, is that his life experiences have taught him that self-study, self-understanding is essential to living a fulfilling life. He says this, and again I'm quoting him, "I study myself more than any other subject." He reminds us that the expression, know thyself, which was inscribed in a famous Greek temple of antiquity, is extremely important to mull over. Indeed, Socrates and Plato believed that expression, know thyself, is the foundation of wisdom. Socrates and Plato believed that wisdom is nothing else but the fulfillment of the command to know thyself. Again, wisdom, according to Plato, Socrates, and Montaigne, and other many famous writers, wisdom is nothing else but the fulfillment of the commandment to know one's self. The Buddha commented on ignorance of oneself, and the Buddha said this: because of one's ignorance, much of one's pain is self-chosen. In other words, the idea is, if we weren't so ignorant about ourselves, we would suffer less. Freud said something similar. Freud said that greater self-knowledge and greater self-understanding will help us to dramatically reduce our suffering. The Bhagavad Gita, a very famous Hindu holy book, also addresses itself to this subject of ignorance of self. And allow me to quote a particular passage from the Bhagavad Gita which deals with this. "For those whose ignorance of the self has been destroyed by knowledge, this knowledge is like the sun, flooding the highest reality with light." Montaigne talked about the importance of recognizing one's own ignorance. Again, the importance of recognizing one's own ignorance. Here are Montaigne's own words. "To recognize one's ignorance is one of the surest signs of judgment that I know." So if one again can recognize, acknowledge, admit to ignorance about oneself and other important themes in life, that's really the beginning of the path to wisdom. That we are all ignorant in one way or another. Let me say that again. We are all ignorant in one way or another. And if we can't recognize our ignorance, well, then there's no way to deal with it. Whereas, if we can recognize our ignorance, well, then we can do something to dispel some of that ignorance. And again, to live more fulfilling lives. Emerson, whom I, again, did a series of programs about, he said, life is a train of moods. Life is a train of moods. We experience so many different moods each day, for example. Well, the trick, according to Montaigne and Emerson, the trick is reducing one's bad moods and coping, enduring with those bad moods we can't eliminate. And unfortunately, there are some sad moments in life, rough spots in life that can't be eliminated. Montaigne claimed that experience had also taught him that if he can better control his emotions, life will have a sweeter flavor. And how does one control one's emotions? Well, by monitoring one's thoughts and feelings, by thinking about one's thinking, by thinking about what one is experiencing emotionally. Montaigne puts this in perspective. Here are his own words. We must converse with our thoughts. We must converse with our thoughts. He goes on to say, the greatest men make it their vocation. Those for whom to think is to live. Those great thinkers for whom to live is to think. In other words, we must be witnesses to our thoughts and feelings. This involves self-awareness, so that if I'm feeling afraid, or nervous, or envious, or anger, or lustful, if I have self-awareness, I can say to myself, gee, I'm nervous, and then do something, perhaps try to do something that will either reduce or eliminate one's nervousness. But self-awareness comes first. The idea is that the sooner we are aware of how a thought or a feeling is causing a bad mood, the sooner we can deal with it and change our mood. Montaigne says it's very important for us to be especially vigilant about those emotions, those passions which tend to rule us. Montaigne believed that different people are ruled by different emotions, and that if we can see an emotion coming on, one of our ruling passions coming on, an emotion which often hurts us, then we can do something to stifle the bad effect it might have on us. Montaigne reminds me of something another very famous thinker, one of my favorite thinkers, said about human nature. Seneca believed that every person is a slave. That's right. Every person is a slave to a particular feeling or aspect of daily living. For example, and these are the examples Seneca gave. Seneca said, every person is a slave to money, or to lust, or to ambition. And of course, there are many other ways one can be a slave. One can be a slave to wanting to be a popular person. One can be a slave to wanting power over other people. One can be a slave to one's feelings of inferiority, or superiority for that matter. Yes, one can be a slave to one's feelings of superiority and suffer from those feelings. One can be a slave to competition. One can be a slave to unrealistic expectations about marriage, about children, about social status. And yes, one can have unrealistic expectations about sex. What else did Montaigne's life experiences teach him about life? Well, that life is often difficult. Montaigne described life in this way. Montaigne said that human life is sweet and it's bitter. Human life is bitter sweet. He went on to say this, and I'm quoting him. In fact, before I quote him, Montaigne compares life to music. And again, here's what he says. Our life is composed of varying tones, sweet and harsh, sharp and flat. He says a musician must be able to employ them together and blend them. And so too, we must accept the good and the bad in our lives. life is impossible. I should say our existence. Our existence is impossible without this mixture of good and bad. Montaigne goes on to say that any attempt to make life work in a way in which it won't is an act of foolishness. Montaigne, in some of his essays, emphasizes the right education of children. In fact, he says that perhaps there is nothing more important in society than providing the proper education for children. Indeed, he has an essay entitled On the Education of Young People. He warns in this essay about making life too easy for children and young adults. Why? Why might it be a bad idea to make life too easy for young people? He says it's a bad idea because young people must be prepared for the difficulties they will face in life, the unavoidable difficulties they will face in life. Montaigne stresses the idea that we must learn to endure whatever suffering we cannot avoid. We must learn to endure whatever suffering we cannot avoid. He goes on to say that everyone must be a soldier, a warrior in a certain sense. How so? How is each of us supposed to be a soldier? Here are his own words. Anyone who is capable of bearing the misfortunes of ordinary life has no need to increase his courage to be a soldier. He then quotes Seneca, "To live is to fight. To live is to fight." Reminds me of something Thoreau said. Thoreau said that life is a warfare, a struggle. But yet, Thoreau, like Montaigne, did believe we can experience much joy and tranquility in life, despite the many difficulties life involves. And what is Montaigne's formula for living a more satisfying life? Well, Montaigne believed there are at least three main ingredients in living a fulfilling life. Besides self-study, introspection, acquiring a greater knowledge of oneself, a greater understanding of oneself, the second ingredient in living a good life is something I've already mentioned: endurance, perseverance, fortitude. And finally, besides self-study and endurance, the third ingredient in a fulfilling life, according to Montaigne, is virtue. Montaigne, like so many of the great writers, believed that it's in our selfish interest to be virtuous. It's in our selfish interest to be good people. That whether or not there's a God, whether or not there is a heaven or a hell, life will have a sweeter flavor if we try to be good people, if we try to be kind people. Montaigne's own words: there is a certain gratification in doing good deeds which gives us joy. And, again his own words, a generous pride accompanies a good conscience. Montaigne goes on to say, the kind of joy that good people experience cannot be experienced by wicked people. Where else did Montaigne look for tranquility and joy? Well, he looked for tranquility and joy in reading wisdom books. Montaigne was an inveterate reader. Indeed, he has an essay entitled On Books. And why did he believe reading good books was a very valuable experience? Let me give you his own words. In books, I only look for the pleasure of honest entertainment. Or if I study, I only look for that learning. I only look for that learning which tells me how to know myself and teaches me how to live well and die well. So he wants to read writers who can help him to live well and die well. By the way, Montaigne's essays are full of quotations from famous writers of antiquity. Indeed, Montaigne had some quotations from famous writers painted on the walls of his study where he did his writing, where he wrote his essays. Montaigne went on to say this about books. Books have served me not so much for instruction as for mental exercise. How many Americans, how many people in general throughout the world get enough mental exercise? In our society, we often stress getting enough physical exercise. But how often do people stress the necessity of getting enough mental exercise? I'll have much more to say about Montaigne next week. But as usual, I'd like to conclude with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau believed we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, he penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."